Well, from very sunny Rio de Janeiro, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Chris Stenzel. I am from the Linguistics Department at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And I'd like to welcome you to another session of Abralim ao Vivo, Linguists Online. This is an initiative of Abralim, the Associação Brasileira de Linguística, in partnership with several other international organizations, including the Comité Internacional Permanente de Linguistes, the Asociación de Linguística y Filología de América Latina, Sociedad Argentina de Estudios Lingüísticos, the Linguistic Society of America, Linguistics Association of Great Britain, and the Australian Linguistic Society. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Bernard Comrie. Dr. Comrie received his PhD in linguistics in 1972 from the University of Cambridge. He lectured there for 6 years before joining the faculty of the Linguistics Department of the University of Southern California, where he remained for 2 decades. From 1998 to 2015, he was the director of the Department of Linguistics at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. He's been a distinguished professor of linguistics at the University of California in Santa Barbara since 2002 and took up full-time residence there in 2015. Dr. Comrie is well known to all of us for his contributions to the fields of historical linguistics, language universals, and typology, with seminal works in tense and aspect, transitivity and voice, and numeral systems. He's also an experienced field worker and specialist in languages of the Caucasus, Papua New Guinea, and the Andaman Islands, which is where Dr. Comrie takes us in his talk entitled Resurrecting the Linguistic Past, What We Can Learn from Akabea. Dr. Comrie, we thank you immensely for joining us today, and I turn this over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And my thanks to the organizers and sponsors of the series for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today. Sorry, a problem with the handout. All is well now. The work that I will be reporting today is joint work, although I get to give the presentation. The research was done together with my colleague, Raul Zamponi. I think he is probably out there somewhere in the audience, so I want to acknowledge his contribution, his major contribution to the work that I will be reporting. The part of the world that we're going to is the Andaman Islands, which you see on this map in the red rectangle. So in the Indian Ocean, more precisely in the Bay of Bengal, an area which is remote, perhaps not so much because of its geography as because of its sociology. So an area which for a long time was avoided by those sailing through those seas. There are at least 2 indigenous language families spoken on the Andaman Islands. Great Andamanese, the language family that we'll be concerned with today, and Ongan. Linguistically, they are quite distinct. Even non-linguists, administrators in the Andaman Islands in the 19th century recognized this. They're linguistically quite distinct. They're also distinct cultures. And as we know from recent work, they're distinct in terms of population genetics. This sketch map shows you the location of the languages. I will keep going back and forth between map and text. So I will mention the Ongan family, that's the family we're not going to be concerned with today, has 2 languages in it, definitely, Unge and Jaroa. So Unge down here on Little Andaman Island, Jaroa, the interior, so the heavy jungle area in the interior of South Andaman. Jangil here, incidentally, is not demonstrably a separate language. It's probably a variety of Jaroa. In addition, on North Sentinel Island, the language, which we call Sentinelese, is spoken. The population is virtually uncontacted. We know very little about them, virtually nothing about their language. Their culture is more similar to that of Ongan-speaking groups, so their language may well be a third member of the Ongan family, but we do not definitely know that. The language family that we will be concerned with, the Great Andamanese family. Traditionally, 10 ethno-linguistic groups have been recognized, although for some of these varieties, we have virtually no documentation. Indeed, for one, basically all we have is a few lexical items, none of which is distinct from those of the neighboring language. So although there are traditionally 10 varieties, there may not have been as many languages in the sense of mutually intelligible versus mutually unintelligible groupings, perhaps as few as 6, somewhere in between those numbers. So going roughly from south to north, in the south we have the two South Andamanese languages, Akabea in orange here, and Akarbale in brown. So that's the language group, and in particular Akabea, that we'll be speaking about today. Then we have the three varieties grouped together as Middle Andamanese, so Okojuai, Akakol, and Apuchikwar, this area here. You can see them listed here. So Okojuai and Okol are very close, may even have been a single dialect continuum. And then in the far north, we have the North Andamanese Akakede subgroup. So Akakede here, and then the 4 North Andamanese varieties, which may well have all been dialects of a single language with high levels of mutual intelligibility, although the evidence is not 100% clear. And as we'll see, it's unlikely that we will ever get new evidence. So those are the traditional languages, and also locating Akabea, the language that I will be talking about today. In addition to those traditional languages, of which the Ongan languages are still spoken, have small, viable speech communities, though of course vulnerable because of their small size. The traditional Great Andamanese languages are all extinct. What survives of the family, what has been called present-day Great Andamanese, is an amalgam of North Andamanese varieties based mainly on Akajeru, one of the northern varieties. Currently, so these statistics are from April of this year, there are 3 semi-fluent speakers, perhaps more accurately rememberers of the language, so they do not usually speak the language. The community language is Hindi. There has been substantial recent work on present-day Great Andamanese by Anvita Abbi, a dictionary published in 2012, a grammar in 2013, as well as a number of articles. This is the first extensive work on any Great Andamanese language meeting current standards of linguistic description and analysis. Otherwise, as I said, all the Great Andamanese languages, the traditional languages, are extinct. The last speaker of Akabea, who was also the last ethnic Akabea, died sometime between the 1921 and the 1931 censuses. I emphasize, in the case of Akabea, this was not a case of language shift. The last speaker of the language was also the last member of the ethnic group. The indigenous inhabitants of the Andamans were largely isolated from the outside world through to the mid-19th century. I emphasize largely isolated. This is certainly not complete isolation. For instance, we know that during the period before the mid-19th century, they acquired pottery and also some lexical items connected with pottery, probably through contact with an Austroasiatic speaking group, judging by the vocabulary that they borrowed in connection with the technique. They also at some point acquired outrigger canoes. Again, the linguistic evidence suggests probably through contact with an Austronesian speaking group. But this by and large, state of isolation changed abruptly in the middle of the 19th century, more accurately in 1858, when the British established a permanent settlement and penal colony at Port Blair in traditional Akabea territory. So they brought over prisoners who were considered particularly dangerous, very often political prisoners, though not only, were brought over to this penal colony. Since the islands are isolated, it was a relatively open penal colony, so many of the prisoners actually had their own houses, their own gardens, kitchen gardens, and so on. It was assumed they would not escape because the local people would not be friendly to them, might well kill them. And if they did manage to get a boat and sail away, they were in very dangerous waters. The likelihood of anyone escaping was minimal. However, this did lead to a rapid demographic decline among the Great Andamanese populations, largely due to imported diseases to which the local people had no immunity. So very briefly, in the years immediately after 1858, there were at least four major epidemics that swept across the Great Andamanese populations, not the speakers of Ongan languages who lived more isolated lives, but epidemics of pneumonia, syphilis, measles, influenza. Given that the traditional languages are not spoken and that Akabea has not been spoken for almost 100 years, you might wonder, what is the documentation of these languages like, in particular, the documentation of Akabea? Well, it's all from the late 19th century, some from the early 20th century, most of it from two colonial administrators. So M.V. Portman worked closely with native speakers of Akabea. He published a manual of the Andamanese languages, which consists of a dictionary of about 1,000 entries, and a phrase book, what he called dialogues. So a phrase book designed for his successors as colonial administrators. Portman also produced some other material, including 3 short narrative texts in total, about 148 words. That is all the natural narrative material we have for the Akabea language. Another colonial administrator, Mann, actually worked largely with non-native speakers. It seemed the early years of the prison, Akabea acquired some status as a local lingua franca among the indigenous populations. So he worked mainly with non-native speakers around Port Blair. He wrote an unpublished grammar, which is in the archives of the Royal Anthropological Institute in London, and also a more extensive dictionary of about 3,500 entries. In addition, one of the founders of British social anthropology, indeed modern social anthropology overall, Radcliffe Brown, A.R. Radcliffe Brown, worked on North Andamanese, but also provided some linguistic material, including some from Akabea. Should emphasize, none of these was a linguist and certainly not a phonetician. So given this perhaps unpromising sounding material, what are we able to say about the languages? Well, as they say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So if you want to see what Raul Zamponi and I have been able to extract from the material, then I can refer you in more detail to our forthcoming Akabea grammar. It should be out next month with Oxford University Press. I think both a published book and an online resource. But there are clear limits on our knowledge. For instance, in phonology, we know from the descriptions given by Portman and Mann from their discussion that the Great Andamanese languages generally, including Akabea, have retroflex consonants as distinct phonemes. That was not their terminology, but it's clear from what they say that there are minimal pairs. But they then go on to say that since they did not hear the distinctions consistently, they decided not to represent it. So we know that there were distinct retroflexes. We don't know exactly where they occurred. We can get some information by comparing to present-day Great Andamanese, so the work of Anvita Abbey. Great Andamanese clearly has phonemically distinct retroflex consonants. Where there are cognates, it would be a reasonable hypothesis, though of course not 100% guaranteed, that there would be retroflexes in Akabea as well. We can say very little about the discourse structure of Akabea. We only have 6 spontaneous texts. Note that Portman's dialogues are not, of course, spontaneous texts. They're dialogues that he made up and had translated into Akabea. So those 6 spontaneous texts, 3 narratives, less than 150 words in total, and 3 songs which provide problems of their own, even to native speakers at the time. Not everything in the songs was intelligible. However, there are other areas where the available material gives us an insight into the intricate grammatical complexity that characterized the traditional varieties of Great Andamanese languages, to a large extent also present-day Great Andamanese. For instance, Akabea had a number of series of personal pronouns not matched directly by anything in the morphology of full noun phrases. It had 12 series of personal pronouns, 5 expressing various oblique adverbial relations, and 7 expressing correlations, like subject, direct object, indirect object. This includes 4 used only for subjects, and 1 further one used for subjects and some other core arguments. So a rich set of distinctions for marking subjects in the pronoun series, pronoun system. Series 1, for instance, was used for an emphasized subject. So if we have an example like one here, I am not a woman, the pronoun from series 1, dol, is used. Notice each of these pronoun forms will have a prefix, which indicates person and number, or sometimes just person, so de for first person singular, and then a base, which indicates which series it's from. If the subject was not emphasized, so a non-emphasized subject, provided the tense is non-past, and with the exception of certain sentence types that I come back to in a moment, then you use type 2. So I sleep without any emphasis, you'll simply have the form do, not dol, but do. If this were in the past tense, or if it were a dubitative polarity question, or if it were a relative clause, you would use series 3, da in the first person, na in the second person. So I slept in the past, da. What is the name of this wood that you are cutting? The relative clause that you are cutting, since it's a relative clause, even though the time reference is in the present, nonetheless, we must use set 3. Set 4 is restricted to subjects of nominalizations. Nominalizations are frequent in Akabea, as in other Great Andamanese languages, because the basic way of negating a verbal clause, so say, I know the way, the basic way of negating that, I do not know the way, is to nominalize the clause and then make that the subject of the verb to be. So I do not know the way comes out as something like, my knowing the way is not, or there is not my knowing the way. And in that construction, you must use a pronoun from set 4. So in negation, the pronoun will be from that series. Donna is the first person singular form. This series, incidentally, is specific to nominalizations. It's not a general possessive, as you might expect in many other languages, as the subject of a nominalization, my knowing. No, it's a specific series used only in nominalizations. In addition, for subjects, but also for other core arguments, direct objects, indirect objects, there's a 5th type, series 7, which consists just of a consonant, which is procliticized to the verb. It can only occur with a verb form that begins with a vowel. So I will finish it. Here you have the proclitic de, first person singular, series 7 form, but that can also be used for non-subject. So show me that, then again, the me is that form 7. So what we see there is a very intricate system. The material, though not 100% consistent, there may well have been misunderstandings, nonetheless is very consistent with those generalizations. So it's an intricate system and one that is maintained by and large consistently across all the documentation. What I want to do now is to look at 2 areas in somewhat more detail to illustrate 2 typologically, cross-linguistically interesting features of Akabea. For the most part, they would also hold for other great Andamanese languages. Certainly the first thing I'm going to talk about, body part prefixes. This is true for all great Andamanese languages. The second phenomenon, verb root ellipsis, is attested for some, but not all. We don't necessarily know whether the non-attestation means it didn't exist or just that the attestation does not go that far. But let's start off with body part prefixes or somatic prefixes. We'll abbreviate them with the letter SP, in particular when they occur in glosses. So these are prefixes that refer to body parts like head or back or extremity, hand, leg. These are body part prefixes, which are a major feature of the language. In fact, in our grammar, with roughly 258 pages devoted to the grammar itself, roughly 47 treat somatic prefixes. Of the 148 words in Portman's 3 narratives, 24 of them, so roughly 1 in 6, so 24 of them have a somatic prefix. The prefix can attach to noun roots, to verb roots, to adjective roots, and to adverb roots. Crucially, these prefixes, though they refer to a body part, are not cognate with the corresponding noun. So as you will see, the prefix for head or the prefix for mouth is not cognate with the word for mouth. Indeed, some of the prefixes have a semantic range for which there is no corresponding noun. One of the prefixes, ar, covers the abdomen, the back, and the leg. There's no single lexical item which covers that range. There are 8 somatic prefixes in Akabea, 2 of which are rare, so they may have been going out of use in the system, but the other 6 are very frequent. 1 denoting the body as a whole, so ab or a. The second one, one which I'm going to concentrate on, aka, referring to the mouth. Ar, which I've already mentioned, the abdomen, back or legs. Aya, a rare one for the inside of the ear or for the ear. Ig, variant ij, for the face and the arms. On, variant oyo, for the extremities, the hands and feet. Ot, variant ot, for the head. And oko, variant oko, for the lips, that a rare one. Now, such body part prefixes are rare typologically, and I should maybe say body part affixes. I do not mean that there are lots of other languages that have body part suffixes. It seems that all the languages we know of with body part affixes do have prefixes. All of the other ones that we know of are concentrated in the Americas, so Panoan languages in South America, Totonacan languages and Purepecha, labeled as Tarascan on this map, in Mesoamerica, and then a cluster of families and isolates, so probably an aerial feature here in the Pacific Northwest, so Cilician languages, Chimakuan and Takelma. So it's certainly typologically rare and not characteristic of the area where Great Andamanese languages are spoken. The point that I'm going to concentrate on talking about somatic prefixes, and in particular, aka, the prefix, these body part prefixes, though having a clear prototypical meaning, a clear basic meaning, nonetheless get extended. Some of these extensions may be still synchronically valid, others perhaps only are reflections of diachronic processes of extension, so that mouth, for instance, can get extended to adjacent parts of the anatomy, like the chin or the throat, to things connected with the mouth, like tasting, eating, food, speech, to things that look like a mouth, so hole, for instance. And we can then get further semantic chains, going from some of those derived items to items that at first sight might seem completely distinct. You know, what is the similarity, for instance, between mouth and sailor or watercraft? Now, I do not expect you to internalize this diagram. As we go through examples, I will repeat the relevant part of the diagram. So, of course, this prefix is used with words that refer to the mouth. The word for mouth itself, akabang, note that the prefix aka bears no relation to the root bang. A bang also occurs as a verb where it means to make a hole in the ground. To shut the mouth, akamewadi. Mewadi on its own is the general verb to shut. Akaetal, the tongue, obviously a part of another body part connected with the mouth. We also get extension to the chin, so the word for chin itself, akaada, but also hairless on the chin, clean shaven, akatalatim, where aka indicates the body part which is hairless. Can extend from the mouth to the throat, akanilib, to tie something tightly around the throat. Nilib on its own means to tie tightly, but if you want to specify that you're tying something around the throat, around the neck, then you add the prefix aka. Mouth to ear, so akaya, inside of the ear, also the gill of a fish. But very importantly, a whole series of words connected with tasting, food, and further extensions from that. So beringa is the general word for good as applied to non-human reference. If you want to mean specifically tasty, good to eat, then it's akaberinga, so good for the mouth. The word for a turtle, actually one species of turtle, the hawksbill turtle, so a favorite of food, tau. To eat turtle, akatau, so linking the turtle to mouth. General words for food, akaboka, a morsel of food. From food, you can then get a further extension to cooking or eating utensils. So nalama is clean in general, but if you mean clean of a cooking or eating utensil, then the appropriate word is akanalama. So it's clean for the purposes of your mouth, ultimately. Hot or warm, if we're speaking of the weather, is uya. But if you mean to heat a cooking pot, a verb, or the adjective, hot as referring to water for cooking, then it's akauya. So hot, ultimately, with respect to my mouth. Food, of course, can refer to edible things and food sources. So akaban is a pea, something edible, the same root we find in igban, a seed. So a seed in itself is not edible, though put the prefix aka on it, and it's something that resembles a seed, but is edible. Edible thing, food source, can then extend to tree. The Akabea were hunter-gatherers. The gathering was mainly things that they gathered from trees. So the tree is a major food source. That's the link between edible thing or food source or tree. So akatang, maybe not obvious why the word for tree should include a prefix that means mouth, but once one sees the chain of links, then it's clear why this is a plausible link, a plausible development. Also, akakol, a flower, presumably because of the similarity to trees. From tree, you can then go to wood. So trees are not only a source of food, but also a source of wood. So wood, even when wood has been removed from the tree, can also be referred to using this prefix aka. Tarali is to split or to split something in half. But if you want specifically to split a piece of wood, even if this wood has long since been removed from its tree, then the appropriate verb is akatarali. Tree can also take us to undergrowth. Here a nicer opposition. Akamal, to push aside undergrowth. So if you're going through an area with heavy low vegetation, then you need to push it aside in order to make progress, especially if there is no traditional path already worn. So that is described as akamal. Clearly no direct relation to mouth. You're not using your mouth to part the undergrowth. But once we see the chain of links, then it makes sense. Notice that if I use that same verb root, mal, but put on it the prefix ot for head, then it means to part the hair. So I'm dividing the hair in much the same way as I'm dividing the undergrowth in order to make my way through thick vegetation. Trees are also what you use to make canoes. So traditional canoe would basically be a tree cut down and then shaped in order to make a viable water vessel. So canoe, so to approach the shore by canoe, akakag. Notice a very long chain taking us from mouth to canoe, but all the intervening steps reconstructible. That contrasts with arkag, more general verb for visiting by water. Like from canoe, this can extend to watercraft in general. So akabirma is a steamship, obviously a later coinage, so after contact, after the establishment, presumably of the penal colony, or maybe also observations of steamships sailing past in earlier times. So akabirma, a steamship, even though steamships are not necessarily made of wood. And because of that link, anything connected with watercraft, such as the word for a sailor or the word for a fisherman, can also occur with that prefix. So from juru, meaning the sea, we get akajuru, a sailor or a fisherman. Trees are also used for other purposes, not only for making canoes, but also for making arrows, spears, harpoons, so traditional hunting weapons. So very often we find the prefix aka on words relating to such weapons. So to fit a harpoon head to the shaft of the harpoon is akatartel. Compare that with to fit a waist belt to the body, artartel, with that prefix ar, which includes among its body part reference the abdomen, so the waist part. So artartel, to fit a waist belt to the body, akatartel, to fit a harpoon head to the shaft. Going back to mouth, mouth of course will lead us directly to speech. Akategi, voice or language. Tegi, sound. So tegi is any sound. Akategi is a sound coming from the mouth. Akabea, the name of the language, Akabea, and also of the people who spoke it, the Akabea. From Bea, spring water. So this is the language of the spring water, so language associated with some water spring, some source of some natural source of water, then extended also to the people. You may have noted as I went through the names of Great Andamanese languages nearly all of them, in fact, all of them begin with something that is either aka or recognizably similar to aka. So Akabea, Akarbale, Akajeru, Okojuai, and so on. Akamulua, deaf, so again, connected with speech. Akadun, to groan, again, kind of noise made by the human mouth. But from speech can also get more generally to sounds. So akayeng is the sound of surf. So now one stage further on from specifically related to the human mouth. The mouth is an obvious example of an orifice, of a hole. So the word for hole can also have this prefix. Akakor is a hole. Compare that with kor, a circle. So a circle, of course, has a space in the middle, but not necessarily a hole where you could put things, for instance, that you could enter. Akakor is a hole dug in the ground, for instance. And if things can refer to orifices, then they can also refer to containers. Container, again, something where you can put something else. So to open a box, akakalaka, specifically to open a box. Otkalaka means bare. So kalaka presumably means something like uncover. So if you're opening a box, you're uncovering it. Akaela, to fill a vessel with water. Ela, in general, just means to pour water out, to bail out. So if your canoe gets flooded, then you bail out the water. But akaela is specifically filling a container. Mouth can also refer to the front part. Mouth is at the front part of the body. So akacheka, general word for front part. Akapapia, stress is always on the first syllable of the root, one phonological rule we do know from the documentation. So akapapia, to wave the hands in front of the body, contrasting with ijipapia, to flap as of a bird flapping its wings. There are also some examples where the value of the prefix is unclear, at least unclear to us, early 21st century linguists investigating this material from over 100 years ago. So akaboy is a child as soon as it can walk. The root boy means to arise or to get up. Akakeli, to go round a corner. Otkeli, with the prefix for head, means to go round a small island. We've really no idea why. What I hope to have shown with those examples is that this prefix aka in general defines a homogeneous, a semantically homogeneous area. Homogeneous in the sense that for any pair of items, or almost any pair of items, both of which have the prefix aka, we can establish a plausible link between them. Often it's a very short link, sometimes it's a longer link, but we can establish a plausible link between them through processes of semantic extension, so extension to adjacent meanings. Some of those extensions may well have been transparent to speakers of the language. We, of course, will never be able to test that. Some of them may well no longer have been transparent. But in nearly every case, it is possible to reconstruct at least a historical development that takes us from one stage to the next. The other phenomenon that I want to look at is one which we have called verb root ellipsis. I'm going to start off with a quote from the literature on morphological theory, more specifically an article by Trommer on zero exponents. He says, it's a common intuition that zero morphemes are only possible for very specific types of morphemes. They're expected to occur as affixes, but not as roots. Moreover, zero seems more likely with functional material, whether affixal or not, than with lexical morphemes. What we're going to look at are some exceptions to that expectation. So roots which are 0, which show up as 0. Now, there are actually at least two different phenomena that are relevant here. The first one, and which is not directly relevant to Akabea, is that some languages have lexical 0 root. So the root for a particular lexical item is simply 0, contrasting with phonologically overt sequences for other roots. It's a rather rare phenomenon, but certainly well attested cross-linguistically. An example here from the Bardi language of Australia. So ngana, I gave, where we have a first-person prefix, we have a tense suffix, but no root. And that is the general form of the root give in this language. What we are going to be concerned with today are instances of 0 roots that arise through ellipsis. Now, of course, English also has a construction that we might think of as verb ellipsis under certain circumstances of identity and discourse, cross-discourse. I can omit the verb. Lee is singing and Kim is singing too. That can be abbreviated to Lee is singing and Kim is too. But note that what I did there was I ellipsed the whole word singing, stem sing, and the suffix ing. What English does not allow is just dropping the root and retaining the suffix. So I cannot say Lee is singing and Kim is ing too. Okay. So strange that if I had not presented it to you in context, even for a native speaker, it would probably have been totally incomprehensible what I might even have been trying to say. What we find in Akabea and some other great Andamanese languages is precisely this construction as in 11. Sometimes we find an ellipted verb root that is retrievable from the preceding conversational turn. So an example from a mini dialogue, one person says, "Eat some pork now," and the other person replies, "No, I will in the evening." Of course, in English, I can omit eat, but I'm omitting the whole word. What we find in Akabea, first turn in the conversation has the verb eat in the non-past. So, you should eat some pork now. The reply has the non-past suffix. It has a pronoun expressing the subject, I will do, but the root is now 0. All that is left of the verb is the suffix, a suffix with no root, or certainly no overt root. The motion verb to come or to go can be omitted if it is clear from the context. So an example here, will you all go hunting? This is, I think, from one of Portman's dialogues. The root go would have been here, would presumably have been possible, but all that we actually find is the non-past suffix. So again, we have a suffix, but no root that is attached to. The previous word expresses the destination, so we are going to hunting. The verb root hunt, nominalized, hunting, and then the allative suffix, the allative clitic postposition towards hunting. So from the other items in the sentence, we can work out the meaning, but we don't actually have any root there. One might compare that with the kind of ellipsis one gets in German with modal verbs. Kim must go home, so Kim muss nach Hause gehen, with the verb to go. I can omit the verb and say simply Kim muss nach Hause. But notice in German, I have to omit the whole word. I cannot just omit the root and leave the suffix dangling. A nice example with the verb to strike or to hit, perek. This appears apparently context freely, although the number of examples, attested examples, is rather small. Here we have a minimal pair. One example where the verb root is present, the other exactly the same, but with no verb root. Here, the morphology of the verb is somewhat more complex. Let's look first of all at 15a. I will strike you on the head. So the subject pronoun, first person singular, series 2, because it's unstressed, non-past. The verb has the root perek, a body part prefix, ot, referring to the head, a tense suffix, non-past, and a proclitic, series 7, second person pronoun referring to the direct object. So I will strike you on the head. Apologies for the violence in the example, but that's given the limited documentation, alas, I have no choice. It's possible to omit the root, so you can simply say dongotke. I will you on the head would sort of be the literal English translation. Notice what we end up with in Akabea is a proclitic, a prefix, and a suffix, but they are not attached to any root. We are simply left with a kind of dangling sequence of proclitic, prefix, and root. This is a typologically very rare phenomenon. If the only evidence were from Akabea and the documentation of a couple of the other great Andamanese languages, you might well object, well, maybe this is a problem with the documentation, maybe these people who weren't linguists, maybe they just got it wrong. But as it happens, we do have a couple of other clear attestations and one maybe borderline case of exactly very close to the same phenomenon. So in Inuktitut, so an indigenous language of northern Canada, this is actually a variety of northern Quebec. So in this language, we find, and well attested in conversational data, the possibility of omitting actually the verb base, it's the verb root with sometimes a couple of other morphemes, but still you're left with prefixes and suffixes. Well, in this language would be mainly suffixes. You're still left with suffixes that are dangling. In Kwazaa, a language isolate of Brazil, here again, we have this possibility under appropriate conversational conditions. The root of a verb can be omitted if it is retrievable from context. Perhaps also Jingulu, an Aboriginal language of Australia, although there the data are not so clear. It may be that what is going on there rather is omission of part of the root rather than the whole root. So that's a less clear case, but still a candidate case. Raoul and I have incidentally discussed this phenomenon in more detail in an article which came out last year. This map here shows you the geographic distribution of the languages I've just mentioned. So Akabea and other great Andamanese languages here, Inuktitut here, Kwazaa here, and if relevant, Jingulu here. I think probably the only thing one can say about the geographic distribution is that it is not aerial. Okay, it's basically 4 languages, not quite as far apart from one another as they could conceivably be, but coming very close to that. So far, I have told you about the language, and you may say, okay, that's fine, but this language was spoken by people. It was spoken by a community. What about that community? Well, let me fill in a little bit of that gap, specifically with respect to Akabea. Akabea here will contrast with North Andamanese, present-day Great Andamanese. With endangered languages, the situation we're very often accustomed to is one of language shift. As I've already mentioned, that was not the case with Akabea. The demographic collapse led to the complete disappearance, the physical disappearance of the community. There is no Akabea community. There are no Akabea individuals. So we have been using the material from their language. What can we say response to our social responsibilities. First of all, we cannot claim to speak for the Akabea. The documentation we have was done exclusively by outsiders. It reflects the interests of those outsiders, how they want to portray the Akabea people, how they want to portray their language. At best, what we can do is to try and ensure that the Akabea language takes its rightful place as part of humanity's cultural heritage, and that Akabea linguistic material finds its rightful place in linguistic science. Finally, the reason why I am talking to you over this video link rather than perhaps presenting at a conference is because of the pandemic, COVID-19. We can ask about the demographic collapse among the Great Andamanese because the pandemic is very relevant. As I mentioned, the reason, the prime cause of the demographic collapse was a health issue. Introduced diseases to which the local people had no immunity, decimated and in some cases wiped out whole communities. Radcliffe Brown, writing in 1908, this was around the time when he was actually doing his field work in the Andamans, was very conscious of this. He attributed the demographic decline to disease introduced by the carelessness and callousness of individuals. Carelessness, people should have known, introducing an alien population with a high immunity to global diseases into an area where a population does not have that immunity. People should have known that that would lead to health issues. Callousness, or thoughtlessness, once the diseases started spreading, okay, the administrators did provide some kind of minimal health care, but they had other priorities. They decided, looking after the local people is not our main priority. We were sent here to run a penal colony, to run a prison. That's what we're going to do. They could have known from earlier instances of contact, as in the Americas, that this might happen. Certainly, we today know that this can happen. So I think there is a lesson we can draw in the midst of the current pandemic. The lesson is that we should indeed learn from history, that history should not simply be the chronicle of the repetition of the same errors with ever more devastating consequences. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Comrie. That was really interesting. We have a few questions for you. The first one comes from, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but Adam Ferris, who is asking, was the connection between Ongan and Austronesian ever established?
What I referred to here was basically a loan word, so a loan phenomenon, outrigger canoes. I think the question of the external relations of Great Andamanese languages, or the languages of the Andamans more generally, still remains open. Certainly, Juliette Blevins has argued that there might be a genealogical relation between one of the groups and Austronesian, between the other group and Austroasiatic. I think the jury is still out on that. This would require input from experts on Austroasiatic and Austronesian languages. I am neither of those. So I think the answer is no, it has not been established to the general satisfaction of specialists. But I emphasize what one can, in a sense, never do is prove that two languages are not related. Either one succeeds in convincing people or one does not succeed, varying degrees of success, but no way of showing that things are necessarily unrelated.
Thank you. The next question comes from Fred Cummins, who asks, is there any documentation of chants from the Andaman Islands?
Sorry, documentation of chant,
Mhm.
songs.
Chants.
Okay. Well, in the documentation of Akabea, three of the six original texts that we have are texts of songs. So song in this sense would include chants. So the songs sometimes have a chorus. So yes, we do have this documentation. Note of course that well, maybe not of course, but all of our documentation of the traditional varieties is written documentation. We do not have any audio documentation. We do have audio documentation for present-day Great Andamanese, but this is after the demographic collapse, which also led to the loss of many of the traditional cultural practices. As far as I know, we do not have any documentation of present-day Great Andamanese chants. The only text that I've seen published in present-day Great Andamanese is a narrative text collected by Anvita Abbi, published in her grammar, and as is clear in reading what she says about gathering the text, it was not presented as a fluent text. Basically, the speaker would remember a bit, then remember another bit. So it was continually adding bits to this text. So although it is an indigenous text, in some sense a spontaneous text, it was not narrated as a single whole.
Thank you.
For the Ongan languages, the documentation is potentially much better. I have not looked at that documentation in detail, other than some of the documentation on Jarawa, done by Pramod Kumar, but I don't know the details of what has been documented in terms of chants there.
Okay, thank you. Fernando Machado asks, are you studying aspectual realizations of Akabea?
Well, if by that you mean the aspect system, or more generally, the tense aspect mood system, then yes, of course, but bear in mind that the documentation is very restricted. We are able to say a fair amount about the tense system. You will have noticed in the glossing that there's a non-past. There's also a form we gloss as preterite, so one of two past tenses. In addition, there's a tense rather rare in the documentation, which seems to be a kind of pluperfect. We are very much limited by the documentation, so we don't have a clear idea of the richness. In terms of mood, we can recognize imperative and a few other oppositions. In terms of aspect, there is certainly a habitual form, something we can recognize as a habitual, but the kind of documentation that we have does not mean that we can guarantee that we can present a reasonably complete picture of the aspectual system of Akabea as it was spoken in the late 19th century.
Okay, thank you. Cecilia Rojas Nieto asks, is it possible that the link to the Aka prefix for a child that starts walking is related to the fact that he also starts speaking? Okay.
Yes, it's certainly possible. Thank you for that suggestion. One of the problems, of course, once you go beyond the obvious cases, is that human ingenuity is pretty much unlimited. So you can always come up with some explanation. The one suggested there strikes me actually as very plausible. But there is the danger, if you don't have sort of clear links between each meaning and each of its adjacent meanings, the danger is, of course, of reading too much into the data. But thank you for that suggestion.
Okay. The next question comes from Alexander Kobana. He asks, what is the proportion of roots classified with somatic prefixes? And are all word classes compatible with the prefixes?
Okay, the second part I can answer more easily. I mentioned it briefly in passing, but just to repeat, since it was very briefly in passing, the prefixes can occur with different kinds of roots, but with the main lexical classes, lexical word classes. So with nouns, with adjectives, with verbs, and with adverbs. I should, though, maybe emphasize, you might think, well, they occur on nouns, they occur on verbs. Is it some kind of agreement system? The answer is no, it is not. So for instance, if I have the word for a sailor with the prefix aka on it, then a verb that the sailor is doing something or something is happening to the sailor, or an adjective is attributed to the sailor, that will not have the prefix aka because it has nothing to do with mouth. So it's not an agreement system. The question about the proportion of roots, we do have some material on this in the grammar. I don't remember the statistics offhand. And one has to bear in mind that any statistics that we can provide is limited by our documentation. So to some extent, that's somewhat natural documentation. So the dialogues, of course, were not written in order to illustrate somatic prefixes. But in some of the other writings by both Portman and Mann, we do have their explicit consideration of what happens as you add a somatic prefix or change the somatic prefix on a particular root. And there, of course, their selection of examples is determined by their aims in presenting that material. So there one would expect, indeed, to find a higher percentage of somatic prefixes. Raoul and I are also working on a dictionary of Akabea. When that is ready, then it would be possible, again, with all the limitations implied by the documentation, then it would be possible to do a more accurate calculation of percentages occurring with and without a somatic prefix. It's certainly the case, however, that in some areas of the noun lexicon, somatic prefixes, body part prefixes are rampant. But there are also some areas where they're not possible.
Okay, thank you. A related question comes from Stefan Mikhailov. He asks, are there prefixes based on some nouns other than body parts? And if not, do you have any hypothesis as to why not?
No, we have not come across any prefixes based on other kinds of nouns. And I must admit, I had not thought, why not? I mean, if we had found them, then the question of why would probably have occurred to me. But no, there do not seem to be any other such prefixes. I mean, there is a large number of prefixes in Akabea, but the other ones have largely to do with things like valence, so reflexives, causatives, and so on. Not related to kinds of concepts that are typically expressed by nouns. So it seems that this is very much a system of body part prefixes. I should point out that in the Ongan languages, there do seem to be at least the remnants of such a system, so typological parallel. So it may have been an areal feature, of course, a limited area, but this is, as I mentioned, a rather isolated, geographically isolated area.
Okay, thank you. Next question comes from, let me see here. João Paulo Bento. He asked Professor Comrie, what are your difficulties in text analysis? Do you have examples of other extinct languages with fewer syntactic or with smaller syntactic corpora?
Okay, well, I can actually do a brief comparison. So Raoul Zamponi and I have actually worked in detail so far on two languages, so two of the traditional languages, Akabea and Akajeru, which is a variety of North Andamanese. Their documentations are very different. So Akajeru was documented by Radcliffe Brown, the anthropologist. His interest was not so much in the language, although he does have some notes on the language, mainly in the second edition, as an edition appendix to the second edition of his monograph on the Andaman Islanders. His documentation is more a documentation of the lexicon of the language. But since the lexicon includes a lot of things like body part prefixes, various ways of forming nouns, various kinds of compound nouns, various kinds of genitive constructions, and so on, it is actually possible to work out a fair amount of the grammar of the language from that, plus the very few sentences from the language which he gives. His documentation does not include any texts. Any texts in the original language. There are, of course, translated texts, which provided some of the basis for his anthropological work. So overall, for the Great Andamanese languages, the potential exception of present-day Great Andamanese, we have no extensive textual documentation. It's really only those 3 narrative texts from Akabea. So we can extract from those texts what it is possible to extract from those texts. As I say, they're narratives. The 3 songs provide problems of interpretation, so it's rather difficult to do detailed grammatical or discourse analysis based on them. We can do a little bit, but alas, for the most part, we simply have to say we don't really know. The one comment we do have from the people who worked on Great Andamanese languages, this is one repeated by different investigators, is that discourse was very elliptical. So as speakers of English, they found Akabea or Akajeru, whatever it might have been, discourse to be elliptical, a lot of omissions. Of course, it's very hard to interpret exactly what that means. Native speakers of English learning Japanese find Japanese very elliptical. But elliptical, basically, it's a comparative concept. Things which you expect to be expressed in your own language are not expressed overtly in the other language. So we are limited by the documentation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to jump to a question from, let me see here, hold on a sec. Sorry, I just got lost here because it's related, hold on, oh my goodness. On syntax, hold on a second. Oh, yes. So this, I'm sorry, this comes from Mateus de Castro Ramos Fialho. He asks, is the documentation enough to say something about the syntax of Akabea, things like word order or something like that? And I would like to add to that a comment sort of related about the pronominal system. You talked about a system of 12 different sets of pronouns. And I was just wondering if those appeared, all of those appeared in your limited documentation, or if perhaps some of the information about those came from related languages, or whether they were actually all there.
Oh, okay. So let's see. So there are actually 2 different questions. Either the general one on syntax. Yes, it's possible to say a fair amount about syntax since we have many sentences. Especially since Portman compiled this set of dialogues, we actually have very often sequences of question and answer. We also have directive sentences, so giving instructions to people to do things, and sometimes their response as to why, for instance, why it might not be a good idea to do that. So some aspects of syntax, yes, we do have reliable material. It's very clear that Akabea is a verb final language. In fact, it seems to be rather strictly SOV, but there is some zero anaphora. But there's no case marking on the full noun phrases. So it seems that the word order, subject before object, was actually used or was relied on, at least to a large extent, in interpreting clauses. We can say a certain amount about clause combining, but much less than we would like to be able to say, in part because these were dialogues intended to be useful. So you do not get examples, relativizing on instruments, for instance. This is the knife with which I cut the bread kind of example, because it's actually not all that useful in the kinds of practical situations that were involved. So the only examples we have of relative clauses relativize either subjects, transitive and intransitive, or direct objects. But we cannot deduce from that other grammatical relations or other semantic roles were not relativizable. So we have the big problem that there is basically no negative evidence. We know what things are there. We do not know what things might have been there, but are not there. Occasionally, of course, we are told when Mann or Portman are actually discussing something, they might say, or even Radcliffe Brown, they might say, this is not possible, or this is not the way people would actually say it. But there is very little such negative evidence. So I would say clause level syntax, yes, we have a good idea. Phrasal syntax, there are postpositions. We have a good idea of word order within the noun phrase, of the structure of the noun phrase. Clause combining, much less. In particular, if you ask about the translation equivalents of adverbial clauses, there is very little in the material.
And as
then
for
the other question was about the pronoun series. Indeed, all of the pronoun series are attested in the Akabea material, some of them extremely rarely. In fact, I think one of them is only attested in the investigator talking about Akabea. So it's not actually attested in one of the examples in the dialogues, for instance. But all of them are attested. The list may be complete because this is one of the things which the documenters, even though not trained as linguists, it's one of the things that they noticed. So they did actually talk a little bit about this. Although the precise differentiation of the different series, especially for subjects in different kinds of clauses, that is not so explicit in what they say.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to a couple of questions that were sent by Brennan Ramsey. The first is, do you have any future plans for working on Great Andamanese languages? If so, which ones? And then he specifically asks, if you have plans to work on the Onge language, because you said that there was perhaps better documentation out there.
Okay. With respect to our work on Great Andamanese, this is Raul Zamponi's and my work. Yes, we're planning to continue this. As I've mentioned, we have already in manuscript form a monograph on Akajeru, so basically an analysis of all the documentation that is available for that language. For Akabea, we are planning to produce a dictionary as a companion to the grammar. For the other languages, yes, we plan to produce either a monograph or in some cases it might be a collective monograph, so looking at two closely related languages together where the documentation is more restricted. So ultimately, our hope is that we will eventually provide a linguistic analysis of all of the traditional documentation of the traditionally spoken Great Andamanese languages. I would emphasize that for some of the varieties, like Akabo and Akakora, the documentation is basically just a handful of lexical items. So those two languages we actually incorporated into our Akajeru monograph manuscript. The question of working on Ongan, Yes, in a sense, that is the next challenge. I think there are certain issues that need to be taken into account. One is, as I've mentioned, the question of health issues. The Jarawa, so one of the two languages that we know to be part of the Ongan family, made contact with the outside world within the last few decades. Already before the spread of coronavirus, they had a high index of respiratory diseases. So there are ethical questions that arise in connection with extended periods of contact with indigenous people in the Andaman Islands, even the speech communities that are at present viable. So we need to be very careful in that respect. I think another factor is that although Raul and I feel reasonably comfortable working with written documentation, we do feel that for work with the indigenous languages, actual field work on the ground in the Andaman Islands, maybe the people who should be encouraged, many, I know there are some who want to, should be given the possibilities of doing this, are local linguists, so linguists in India who are interested in working on the indigenous languages of their country. So I've already mentioned work by Anvita Abdi on present-day Great Andamanese. That's actually still in the Great Andamanese family. Also Pramod Kumar, who worked on Jarawa. There's still much more to be done there. So on those two languages, looking at the existing documentation, yes, but also maybe extending the volume of documentation. And of course, if this could be done with the collaboration of the local speech communities, then all the better. That's what I would regard as being the kind of ideal situation where the local speech community is working together with linguists, not only documenting the language, but also getting training in documenting the language, eventually in analyzing the language. Now, of course, the final challenge is North Sentinel Island. Sentinelese, which may be an Ongan language, and culturally they seem to be close to speakers of Ongan languages from what we know of their culture, but they have very definitely made it clear that they do not want close contact with the outside world. It's not quite literally true to say that they've had no contact with the outside world. There has been some contact, in one case actually initiated by the inhabitants of North Sentinel Island. But overall, they have taken the decision they would rather be left alone. And I think that is a decision that we have to respect until they give a clear indication that that is not their intention. There is what one might call minimal documentation of Sentinelese, in that an expedition of the Indian government to North Sentinel Island a few years back, which was met in a friendly manner by the local people. There is a video recording, it's actually on YouTube, so it's accessible to anyone. There is a YouTube video of that interaction. So there is some documentation of the language there. Ethical issues do, of course, arise. Did the inhabitants of North Sentinel Island really give consent to that documentation? Would they even have understood what that might have meant? But it's sort of clear that in the abstract, if you want to talk about a last frontier in linguistics, then maybe North Sentinel Island is that last frontier. But for the moment, it is just beyond what we can attain.
Okay, thank you. This question comes from someone whose name I apologize, I'm probably going to pronounce it incorrectly. Madhurima Chakraborty. she said, she, I'm not sure. Professor, can you please enlighten us on convergence? It generally doesn't have a theory as such. How can we link variations to that of convergence?
Well, so the convergence, trying to think how this relates to the material I presented. I mean, Great Andamanese is clearly a language family. So there we would be looking probably more at divergence, how Proto-Great Andamanese diverged into the three branches of the family, how those branches diverged into the individual languages. With regard to typological similarities between Great Andamanese and Ongan languages, certainly there are some. Whether those are the result of convergence or whether they just happen to be there from the beginning, I'm not sure. I do actually have a paper which I've presented elsewhere in the written up version together with Raul Zamponi, now in preparation, where we compare languages of the Andaman Islands with the overall typological profile of Asia. And the Andaman Islands are in some respects very different, so clearly distinct. So we suspect this is because of their isolation. So many of the phenomena that spread, much of the convergence that happened in Asia in general, did not reach the Andaman Islands. So in that respect, they are different, maybe provide us with some insight into what Asia might have looked like if big language families like Indo-European, Turkic, Tai-Kadai, Austroasiatic, Austronesian, and so on, had not spread. There are, of course, instances of contact that we know of between either involving individual Great Andamanese languages, so the people who gave us the linguistic documentation, sometimes also observed social processes. So especially as the traditional communities, as their community life broke down, very often members of different communities moved together. So that led to contact between different, sometimes what are clearly different Great Andamanese languages. And Akakede, which we think is clear from the linguistic record, was most closely related to the North Andamanese languages like Akajeru. Some of the earlier people who looked at it actually grouped it with Middle Andamanese, and this seems to reflect the closer social contact they had with Great Andamanese. Looking further back in terms of convergence, I think it's with respect to the Andaman Islands, I would find it very hard to make any specific claims or to use that material to advance one particular view on convergence rather than another. We have two clearly distinct language families. They share some similarities, but of course, by chance, that will come about. If you have two language families in the same small area, which are completely different on every major typological parameter, then probably that calls as much for explanation as any similarities. In terms of convergence in general, I would refer to the literature on contact linguistics. I don't think that in any reasonable time available to me to answer the question that I would be able to do justice.
Thank you. This question comes, we only have a couple more. This comes from Christian Doller, who, how would you evaluate the role of text corpora in linguistics and language documentation? There seem to be large databases for grammatical or phonological phenomena, but not for texts.
Okay. Well, I think the role of text is very important, and that is why recent initiatives dealing with language documentation have emphasized the importance of collecting different kinds of language use, so different genres in natural language use. In contrast to much earlier work, which would concentrate, for instance, on narrative text. Narrative text is very often the easiest kind of text to gather. So we often have grammars that are based primarily on narrative to the exclusion, certainly of conversation, but also even maybe of procedural text. So I think this is very important, and certainly there are now there have been documentation initiatives and archives which gather such textual material. So DOBES, documentation of endangered languages, funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. The Endangered Languages Documentation Project at SOAS, University of London. And then a number of regional archives which do provide rich textual material. To be used, of course, the textual material does need also to be transcribed, translated, ideally glossed, so that it can be used by other people. One point that apparently aroused some amusement when I first mentioned it was that we do not want to be in the position of Linear A. Linear A is a language known only from the written record, actually quite an extensive written record from, I don't know exactly when, over 1,000 years before the Common Era. Unfortunately, we can't read it. So, in one sense, we have rich documentation of that language, but no bilingual inscription, so we can't even begin to translate it, never mind a full translation or a morpheme gloss. So I think it's important that documentation and analysis go hand in hand. Each will improve the other. So documentation, the value of the documentation will be enhanced by the use we can make of that documentation, in addition to its importance, its cultural importance to the communities where the language is spoken, especially if the language is no longer spoken in the community. And on the other hand, our analysis will improve because we are not just looking at a narrow range of phenomenon, we're looking at language in its full range of uses. Certainly other languages that I've looked at, there are phenomena that I have only become aware of, let's say, as I have moved outside of narrative texts to look at conversations.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. The last question is a general one, but I think it will tie things together for you and for our audience. This comes from Enoch Apaiteku. He thanks you for the interesting presentation and asks if you could share what motivates you to conduct typological studies. Okay.
What motivates me to undertake specifically typological studies is my belief in the importance of differences across languages. When I started in linguistics half century ago, a lot of the emphasis was on similarities across language. If you could find similarities across languages, that was what you were supposed to be doing, showing that languages were basically very similar to one another. But, and this applies to many different approaches to language, so I'm not trying to praise some approaches, criticize other approaches, but a recognition, I think, across the field of linguistics, is that differences across languages are also important. And typology, to me, is the systematic study of differences across languages. So it's the study of differences. I want to know, are there other possibilities for doing this? Let's say I'm working on relative clauses, or I'm working on numeral systems, whatever it might be. I want to know, what is the full range of possibilities that is out there? Trying to get as full an appreciation as possible of the differences that are there. But I also want to try and systematize those differences. So it's not just collecting. It's not just that I have a stamp album and I get a new stamp and I put it and I stick it in because I didn't have that stamp before. No, I want to try and see what general principles of language might emerge, general principles of language or general principles of cognition might emerge from the cross-linguistic variation that I find. So I think the simple answer to your question is an appreciation of cross-linguistic diversity, but also an appreciation that that cross-linguistic diversity gives us insight into the general structure of language. And I would now add to that, also gives us insight into history and especially prehistory, because as we look, let's say, at languages changing typologically because they come into contact with other languages, on that basis we can evaluate, sometimes even reconstruct past historical events, population movements, populations coming into contact with one another. This then feeds into interdisciplinary results coming from other fields like anthropology, archaeology, population genetics, so that we're gaining a better understanding of our history as a species, as well as about our current possibilities.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. It concludes the questions that we received from people who have been participating. Lots of very positive feedback and many thanks. And we would like to add our thanks for your time and for sharing this presentation with us. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add, but that looks like about the end of our presentation today.
Okay, I would just like to thank everyone again for your interest. I was asked what induces me to do typological research. If you were to ask, what induces me to do this at all, then in large part it's the feedback that I get, especially if it's feedback, especially feedback of interest. I don't mind whether you agree with me or whether you disagree with me, but if you're interested in what I have to say, then that will keep me going. Thank you.
Thank you.